Radha Maya.
Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Gopi Janaballabha Giri Varadari. Jai Gopi Janaballabha Giri Varadari.
Yasodanandana Hajadanaranja
जय जय हरि बोल हरे कृष्ण हरे कृष्ण हरे कृष्ण All glories to our Guru Gokanga.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. atra sargo visargascha
Sthanam poshanamutaya manvantarishyanukatha nirodhomuktirashrayah.
Shri Shukavacha
Shri Shukavacha
Trasaga Visagascha
Atra sargo visargascha
Sthanam Poshanamutaya
sthanam poshanamutaya
Manvantareshanukatha
manvantarishyanukatha
Nirodhamuktirashrayah
nirodhomuktirashrayah.
Shri Shukavacha
Shri Shukavacha
atra sarga visargascha
Atra sargo visargascha
sthanam poshanamutaya
Sthanam poshanamutaya
manvantarishanukata
manvantarishyanukatha
nirodho mukti ashrayah.
nirodhomuktirashrayah.
Shri Shukavacha
Shri Shukavacha
Atra Sargo Visargascha
Atra sargo visargascha
Sthanam Poshnamutaya
Sthanam poshanamutaya
Manvantare Shanukatha
manvantarishyanukatha
Nirodho Muktarashraya
nirodhomuktirashrayah. Shri Shuka Uvacha
Shri Shukavacha
Atra sargo visargascha Sthanam poshanamutah manvantareshanukatha nirodho muktirashrayah.
Shri Shukavacha
Shri Shukavacha
Atra sargo visargascha
Atra sargo visargascha
Sthanam pashanam utayah
Sthanam poshanamutaya
manvantarishanukata
manvantareshanukatha
nirodho muktir ashrayah.
nirodho muktirashrayah.
Shri Shukavacha,
Shri Shukavacha
Shri Shukadeva Swami said,
Shri Sukadeva Goswami said,
Atra
in
in
the Srimad Bhagavatam,
Sargaha,
Sargaha,
statement of the creation of the universe,
statement of the creation of the universe,
Visargaha,
Visargaha,
statement of subcreation,
statement of subcreation,
Cha,
also,
Sthanam,
the planetary system,
Poshanam,
protection,
Utaya,
the creative impetus,
Manvantara,
Manvantara,
changes of manus,
Isha Anukatha,
the science of God,
Nirodha,
going back home back to God,
Muktihi,
liberation,
Ashraya,
The translation reads, Sri Shukadeva Swami said, in the Srimad Bhagavatam there are 10 divisions of statements regarding the following. 1. The creation of the universe. 2. Sub-creation. 3. Planetary systems. 4. Protection of the Lord. 5. The creation and the creative impetus. 6. The change of models. 7. The science of God. 8. Returning home back to God. 9. Liberation. And 10. The simple moment. So, I say, please repeat. Sri Sukadeva Swami said,
Shri Sukadeva Goswami said,
in the Srimad Bhagavatam there are 10 divisions of statements
In the Srimad Bhagavatam, there are 10 divisions of statements regarding the following.
The creation of the universe,
The creation of the universe,
sub-creation,
sub-creation, planetary systems, protection by the Lord, the creative impetus, the change of Manus, the science of God, returning home back to Godhead, liberation, and the summum bonum.
Okay, so I'll read the next two verses.
Sorry, Maharaj, could you just make sure the mic is like plugged in or something? Because Hamsa Prabhu says it's not working.
You have to check it over here.
No, I already did. So the only other option is there. Is there something disconnected here? He said there's just no sound, but I checked everything here. There's no input. Is there any input on the actual speaker? Okay. Maybe there's nothing we can do about it. Maybe there's nothing. Oh. Maybe it's just Hamsarupa Prabhu's. Because it's working on his phone. Maybe it's just Hamsarupa Prabhu's phone that's not working.
Okay.
Okay, sorry.
So my working is you're getting.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
One's working, but it's coming from the phone, not from the mic.
Salasya Vishuni Artham Namanam Iha Lakshanam Varnayati Mahatma Shrutinarthena Chandrasekhar. Probably it's not connecting somewhere. Yeah, that looks solid too. Still, you're not getting any kind of. What's that? So you're actually getting it when the stream comes out, but the.
No, before the sound was coming through the phone, not through the microphone on your set, so we couldn't. People online couldn't hear you properly.
I see. So now it's working.
Now it's working.
Okay. Great. Dasamasya Vishuddhi Arthang Navanam Ihalakshanam Varnayanti Mahatmanaha Shrutinarthena Chandrasa. The translation of this verse: to isolate the transcendence of the summum bonum, the symptoms of the rest are described sometimes by Vedic inference, sometimes by direct explanation, and sometimes by the summary explanations given by the great sages. And so the verse, it actually does have a purport. Bhutamatendriya dihyam janma sarga udahritaha brahmano guna vishamyad visarga paurusha smritaha. The elementary creation of 16 items of matter, namely the 5 elements, fire, water, land, air, and sky, sound, form, taste, smell, touch, and the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, skin, and mind, is known as sarga. Whereas the subsequent resultant interaction of the modes of material nature is called visarga. Now this is the purport by Srila Prabhupada. In order to explain the 10 divisional symptoms of Srimad Bhagavatam, there are 7 continuous verses. The first of these, under reference, pertains to the 16
elementary manifestations of earth, water, etc., with material ego composed of material intelligence and mind. The subsequent creation is a result of the reactions of the above-mentioned 16 energies of the first Purusha, the Mahavishnu incarnation of Govinda, as later explained by Brahma in his treatise, the Brahma Samhita, as follows. Please change your orientation. But it's not going to do it. Okay. Ya karanava jale bhajati sma yoga nidram ananta jagadanda saroma kupa andhara shaktim avalambya param svamurtim govindamadi purusham tamaham bhajami. The first Purusha incarnation of Govinda, Lord Krishna, known as the Mahavishnu, goes into a yoga nidra mystic sleep, and the innumerable universes are situated in potency in each and every hair hole of his transcendental body. As mentioned in the previous verse, Shrutena, or with reference to the Vedic conclusions, the creation is made possible from the Supreme Personality of Godhead directly by manifestation of his particular energies. Without such a Vedic reference, the creation appears to be a product of material nature. This conclusion comes from a poor fund of knowledge. From Vedic reference, it is concluded that the origin of all energies, namely internal, external, and marginal, is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And, as explained herein before, the illusory conclusion is that creation is made by the inert material nature. The Vedic conclusion is transcendental light, whereas the non-Vedic conclusion is material darkness. The internal potency of the Supreme Lord is identical with the Supreme Lord, and the external potency is enlivened in contact with the internal potency. The parts and parcels of the internal potency which react in contact with the external potency are called the marginal potency or the living entities. The original creation is directly from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, or Param Brahman. And the secondary creation, as a reactionary result of the other original ingredients, is made by Brahma. Thus, the activity of the whole universe are started. Bhuta matendriya dhyam janma sarga udahritaha brahmano guna vaishamyad visarga paurusham smritaha. The elementary creation of 16 items of matter, namely the 5 elements, fire, water, land, air, and sky, touch, form, taste, smell, sound, form, taste, smell, touch, and the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, skin, and mind is known as sarga, whereas the subsequent resultant interaction of the modes of material nature is called visarga. So this is going to be a very interesting chapter. There are a lot of things going on here. I wanted to start with the explanation of the 10 subject matters of Srimad Bhagavatam, because this is kind of like the table of contents or something like that of the entire book. Usually in our modern literatures, a table of contents comes right at the beginning of the book, where before you even start explaining the subject matter. But here, in this form of transcendental Vedic literature, it comes a little ways into the beginning of the book. And we learn that there are 10 subject matters. Sarga, Visarga, Stanam, Poshanam, Uti or Utaya. Then we have Manvantara, Ishanukata, Nirodho, Muktir, and Ashraya. So these 10 subjects are discussed in Srimad Bhagavatam. And these 10 subject matters, really the first 9 are supportive of the final one, which is the 10th one, which is, as we see here, it's being called the summum bonum, which is a Latin term. The Sanskrit is ashraya, the supreme shelter of everything. Everything comes from a source, everything rests upon a source, everything will ultimately return to a source. And that is the ashraya, the supreme shelter, the supreme resting place, the supreme origin of everything. And that, of course, is Krishna. And that in Srimad Bhagavatam is described copiously in the 10th canto, which has 90 chapters to it. So proportionally, I think the 10th canto absorbs something like 1/5 of the entire Srimad Bhagavatam, or something thereabouts. So it's a huge piece of Srimad Bhagavatam. And we have 9 chapters, or 9 cantos rather, leading up to it. And we have 2 chapters after it. So this summum bonum, or ashraya, is Krishna. And for those in Vedic literature who read it, and or those who read Vedic literature, and suppose that the Supreme is ultimately formless, then this is quite an interesting development, that the Srimad Bhagavatam spends so much time talking about the name, form, qualities, and pastimes of a person, of Krishna. So if ultimately he's formless, what would be the point in that? There would be practically no point in that. But so much of Srimad Bhagavatam discusses the activities of Krishna. So therefore we know that this form of the Supreme is not an incidental thing, it's not a transient thing, it's not an unimportant feature. It is primal and the most important feature. And to understand it correctly, we need to understand these other things, these other 9 aspects. And that's why the pastimes of the Supreme Lord do not immediately start out with, that the Srimad Bhagavatam doesn't start off with the pastimes of the Lord. We get those only after we have made an effort to go through these other explanations. That way, when we meet the Supreme Lord, we don't think of him as an ordinary person. It takes an enormous amount of philosophical development to finally reach the discussion of the Supreme in his pastimes. You know, why in the world are we studying about some little boy in Vrindavan, India, frolicking around, you know, with his friends and then having these funny little relationships with the gopis? Why in the world would we read about that? You know, it seems crazy, unless you've had a huge philosophical buildup to understand that this little boy isn't just a little boy. He's actually the supreme being, the source of everything, the origin of the universe, the origin of the individual living entities. That is why we're reading about him. And his playing, which seems like, you know, something quite mundane, something quite common. All little boys play, you know, nothing very special about that. But these particular pastimes, when we read them, certainly have elements that are fantastic, where, you know, he's killing Aghasura demon or lifting Govardhan Hill. These things most little boys are not doing on a regular basis. So therefore, there's something very special going on here. And these pastimes are not just incidental to Vedic knowledge. These are really the substance, the rasa, of what makes connecting with the Supreme Lord worthwhile. This is what is actually the real purpose of all activities. So these different subject matters are important to understand. So the first one is Sarga. Sarga is the creation that is done by Mahavishnu. So we learn that the Brahma Jyoti, or the white effulgence of the Supreme Lord, is developed by Mahavishnu and agitated, and it becomes first the false ego, and then it becomes the three modes of nature, and then the three modes of nature merge again with the false ego individually and begin to create these forms and varieties, which at first are just substances. They're not actual tangible objects or visible sense items as we see the world today. In the very beginning, they are just categories of energies or essences. And then later on, from Sarga, this basic unfoldment, we get Brahma, and Brahma takes it to the next step. In other words, it's like if you're building an automotive assembly plant. First, you have to have the raw materials. So first there's metal. Somewhere we've got to get metal. There's got to be rubber. There's got to be plastics of various kinds. There has to be, you know, paint and all these kind of commodities. And we have to have sources for them. And on top of it, we have to have blueprints, and then we have to have these machines which will be used to assemble it. We have to have workers and a sense of industrial flow, how the whole thing will map out. So before we chunk out the first automobile, all that has to be in place. So that's kind of what Mahavishnu does. He is like the Lowe's. He brings the ingredients, you know, the wood, the planks, and all that kind of stuff. But there's nothing that's been assembled yet. And Brahma takes it the next step. He's the architect that arrives on site and begins to start hacking and nailing and screwing things together and all that kind of stuff. So this is Visarga. So Sarga is the assembly of the ingredients, And Visarga is those ingredients being assembled into actual forms, planetary systems, locations, all those kind of things. And ultimately, the bodies of the living entities will start to be developed by the universe. So that's Sarga and Visarga. Sthanam is the universal planetary system. So the planetary systems have to be in place before living entities can start populating the planetary systems. And the various planetary systems have different gradations of facilities. Some planets are very opulent and others are not so opulent. And we've learned that also there are planets where things are very terrible, where people suffer. So this is the Sthanam, the planetary systems. We learn about them. Poshanam is the protection of the Supreme Lord. Those who are the Lord's devotees are protected by the Lord. They're protected from physical harm in some cases, and they are protected from becoming polluted if they are serious about their practice of sadhana. And in this way, we see that the Lord protects his devotees. So that's Poshanam. That's a very important aspect of Srimad Bhagavatam. Uttaya is, or Utti, is called the creative impetus, and that's one of the more sort of cryptic sounding categories here in these 10 aspects of creation. Utti, or Uttaya, is the creative impetus. Why do people do things? Or for that matter, why not just people, but all living entities? Why do they do things? Well, there are two reasons. One of them is the most common reason, because they are seeking sense gratification or sense satisfaction in some way. So that is the most common utti, or impetus. There's another one, which is a few of them are seeking to connect themselves back up with the Supreme Lord. That's the other possibility. And that's a desirable possibility. Then we have the Manvantaras. There are 1,000 Chatur Yugas in one day of Brahma. There's also 1,000 in his night, so altogether there are 2,000. But nothing goes on. Brahma just hangs the out to lunch sign there on the whole night. Nothing going down in the night cycle of Brahma. But in the day cycle, there are 1,000 ages, and those are divided into 14 manus with approximately 71 full yuga cycles for each manu. We are in the 7th manu now, and so there are some more to come. There are 6 manus that preceded us, one right now that we're in, and 7 more to come after this manu. So each manu goes through Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga. And then again, Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, Kali Yuga. Those are Chatur Yugas, so that revolves 71 times, and then we get a new Manvantar. And so this is what the Manvantaras are discussing. Ishanukata talks about the Supreme Lord, who is the Supreme Lord. Nirodha is the winding up. It's sometimes described as the destruction of the material universes. And here in the word for word, Prabhupada gives us a different view, that it is the destruction of the living entity's false conceptions and his leaving the material universe. So that's another understanding of Nirodha, which means winding up. So the material universe gets wound up at a certain point at the end of Brahma's day. And similarly, not at the end of Brahma's day, but all throughout the existence of the universe, there are living entities who are finishing their false duration of time here in the material universe, and they're going out of it. So mukti is liberation. And finally, we have the last one, which, as we said, was ashraya, or the Supreme Lord, the shelter of everything. Yesterday, I looked on the internet. It's actually a good video done by a devotee named Gauranga Darshana somewhere in India. And he's giving a brief overview of these, and he tells us that Sarga and Visarga are in the second and third canto, mostly described. The entire Bhagavatam does touch on all these subjects all the way through, but there are primary focal points in various cantos. So Sarga, where we have basic creation, is described in the second and third canto, which is what we've been hearing. That's where we are right now. Visarga is in the third, fourth, and fifth canto. Stanam is in the fifth canto, Poshanam in the sixth canto mostly, Uti in the seventh canto, the Manvantaras are described in the eighth canto, Ishanukata is in the ninth canto, Nirodha is in the 12th canto, and Mukti in the 11th, and Ashraya finally in the 10th canto. So that's kind of interesting. And in this way, we can learn about the universe that we live in and why we're here. There is no other religious scriptures anywhere that describe this in any kind of detail. This is just unique to Srimad Bhagavatam. To understand how the material universe unfolds itself, into the third verse that we read today, we learn this unfolding process of the energies. First we have what's called the white light, which is the pradhan, then it becomes the mahatat, and then the mahatat further distinguishes into false ego, and then the three modes of nature. And when the mode of darkness, or tamasa, blends again with false ego, we get the first manifestation, which is ether. From ether, we get sound, and then sound generates air. From air, then we get touch, and touch generates fire. And from fire, we get form, and form generates water. And from water, we get taste, and taste generates earth, and earth then generates smell. So here we have an unfolding of gradually denser and more sensually available essences. So ether, we can't do much with that. We can't sense it in any kind of way. It's something that we just understand as a conceptual item. Whereas sound, at least we can hear it, and air, at least we can feel it when it comes in contact with our body. Whereas on the other end, at the very bottom, we have earth, which we can see, we can hear it, we can taste it, we can smell it. All the properties of the senses are there in the final output. So these are denser and more sensory available items. And in this way, our world is is created, the reality that we live in, this false sort of artificial reality that we walk around in, is created in this manner. And when we learn about this, and we learn that indeed it is artificial creation, we learn that we should get out of it. That's the most important thing that we come away with. And we begin to see that things are indeed real in one sense, in that they come from the Supreme Lord, but they aren't what they appear to be. And what's going on in this world appears to be a place where we can try to enjoy the various objects of the material world, but somehow that never really works very well, and we're frustrated. And so the Bhagavatam is telling us that's what it looks like is going on here, but that's not what's actually going on here. What's actually going on here is that the Supreme Lord is allowing us to pretend to be gods and goddesses, and we can play that game as long as we want, but eventually we need to figure out that that is a foolish game, and we need to nirodho, we need to get out. So these 10 subject matters are one by one helping us to get a grasp on what's going on here, helping us to put everything into perspective. So I want to leave some time for questions. There's a lot more to this, but at any rate, any questions or comments from our group here? Yes?
I was just thinking, like, I put it in layman's terms, Saga and Visaga. Krishna, more or less, he like creates like a sandbox, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then for all the Jews, they can come and
Build their
build
sandcastles,
in
right?
different ways, and they think I'm creating, new life and this, and but really it's just creating a sandcastle. The ingredients are ordered, everything is good.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is this material world is so complex and mysterious that you can imagine anything you want is going on here, and it's hard to disprove it. At the same time, it's hard to officially and completely prove it either. So therefore, people can walk around in this world, Prabhupada hints at it in the purport, and imagine that everything is just being created from material elements, which is officially the atheistic, materialistic view of the world. So there are people, and no small percentage of them, who believe that basically somehow or another atoms and molecules bumping around, or what we call the elemental categories, interact with one another, and somehow or another, bump up more and more complex forms, and somehow or another at the end of it we get, humans zipping around in various little, spaceships and rocket ships like the Jetsons or something like that. And, this all happens as a result of just interactions on the very most basic level. And this is what I call a bottom-up universe, that everything is happening from interactions at the very lowest level. And they talk about this emergence of how one level of not very complex things creates somehow or another, mysteriously, magically, a higher level of more complex things, and that creates mysteriously even a more higher level of higher things. So that's one worldview. We, however, talk about a top-down universe where we start off with the most intelligent thing, which is Lord Brahma in a universe, and he has to, like the first roadie that comes to a rock concert, he has to start getting the instruments ready and wiring everything up and doing the sound checks and doing the volume and all that kind of stuff. So this is a top-down universe. And indeed, there are mechanisms and mechanical structures to the material universe, but there are also operators, and those are the various demigods who have their various positions. And the whole purpose of the various positions of the demigods, the planetary systems, and various bodies is to give people the karma that comes with their behavior. So whatever we do nets us a particular planet, it nets us a particular body, it nets us a particular time period, and then we come out and we do our little dance, and we create more karma for the most part, and then we get a chance to die and do it all over again. And usually, sometimes not in such a good situation. Oftentimes, we wind up being demoted into animal forms or lower. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much, Maharaj, for that nice lecture. So out of these 5 elements, fire, water, land, air, and sky, I think sky is what ether is, right?
Yes.
So I'm speculating maybe ether could be vacuum. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, it seems to me that what I think of in terms of what sky or ether equates to in our modern sort of view of things, sort of scientific language would be the time-space continuum, that it is not any particular substance, it is the empty whatever it is. Of course, modern quantum physics describes the empty space even as being a wash of virtual particles that are in hyper, active vanishing and creating and vanishing and creating. So it's something like that. It is just space itself without any matter of any kind in it. That's kind of what ether is. From that, everything else is generated. Ether is a little bit more than that in the Vedic perspective, because things are generated from it. From ether, we get a little denser something happening, which is of course air, and then gradually we get the more dense and more complex elements with ether, then we get air, then we get fire, then we get water, then we get earth or solid substances.
Nowadays they are describing matter and another is antimatter.
Yeah. Well, matter and antimatter are just basically 2 forms of matter, basically. It just depends on where the protons are, whether they're on the inside or the outside, That's just, 2 different flavors, basically. It's interesting the way Prabhupada uses the word antimatter, because he describes antimatter as meaning literally what is not matter, which is by definition spiritual essence, in Prabhupada's view. So sometimes people might be bewildered if they read Prabhupada's explanation from the perspective of having been schooled, in our modern scientific lingo, The scientists, when they talk about antimatter, they mean matter with the negative charged particles on the inside in the core and the positive charged particles zipping around on the outside instead of vice versa. That's what they mean. But Prabhupada meant antimatter is that which is not matter, namely spiritual essence. Of course, between matter and spirit, there's that subtle matter, which scientists don't study at all, which is ego, false mind, and false intelligence. This is subtle matter. It's still matter, but it's subtle. And these 3 subtle aspects of matter really have a big impact on what's happening at the gross level, but scientists are totally unaware of that, what to speak of the spiritual. So this chapter, chapter 10, from the first verse up to verse 9, discusses this, subject matters. These 10 subject matters are kind of elaborated. Then from 10 to 31, we find out about the Supreme Lord, who is the ashraya, or shelter of everything. And then from 32 to 51, which is the last part of chapter 10 of Canto 2, we will hear about the Supreme Lord as being beyond the material coverings. So that's kind of how this chapter 10 is going to pan out. Any other questions or comments? There's a lot actually going on here. And when we begin to read about the details of how this universe is created, how a living entity is thrown into it, what kind of things happen to the living entity, the struggle with material senses, karma, death, and rebirth. When we learn all these things, suddenly the mysterious nature of this world becomes less mysterious. And the more important thing is we begin to realize what the real object of the game is, because you can know the details of how atoms work, you can understand, how electronics works, you can understand meteorology, how the weather pans itself out. You can understand various statistical trends, you can understand various kinds of sociology, you can learn medicine and how the body works, you can learn the details of how political structures come together and how they clash with one another. You can learn the details of various life forms, at least how they mate, how they colonize, how they work together. You can learn all these things, but if you never learn what the real purpose of the game is, and that is to recognize that this is a, Disney World, basically. We're in a giant Disney World, and eventually we start to realize that we want to get out of it. I tell the story sometimes that when I was young, when I was a little boy, I heard about Disneyland. And at that time there was only one Disneyland, and that was in Anaheim, California. And I really, really wanted to go there. I dreamed about it, I thought about it. But we lived in Missouri. We were far away from California. And my parents never went to, never took a trip to California to go to Disneyland. However, when I was about 22 or 23, I was no longer living with my parents then, and I was in California. And my parents came out to California, and they asked me to come to Disneyland with them. And so here it was, Krishna fulfilled my desire to go to Disneyland, but I was 22 at the time. And I had absolutely no interest in it whatsoever. And the thing that struck me the most was how it scaled down, like if you're a little kid, it's like little kid proportions, So everything, when you're a full human being, you think, why is that building so small? Why are those chairs so tiny, So it's kind of like that, that you really feel it's an artificial reality. And so Krishna allows us to outgrow that attraction to the Disney world that we are, inhabiting. And that point, we have reached Nirodho or Mukti, as we could call in this particular section. But neither of those are worth anything if it's not connected to the Supreme, to the Ashraya, to Krishna. Because through serving and developing a relationship with Krishna, then we know we want to engage in an active relationship. And then that means we are candidates for going to the spiritual world, where we don't have any of these, creation or winding up. We don't have any shrishtis or pralayas, we're just in one situation that continues. The creational aspects are missing in the spiritual world. Other questions or comments to wrap up here? Okay. So I appreciate you all taking the time and putting up with me for an hour. All glories to Srimad Bhagavatam, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.